Why should people of faith, communities of faith, get involved in policy issues? I think those of us who are gathered here right now in Brasilia know that in all of our faith traditions, there is a demand, there is an imperative that we create a world where everyone has enough, a world where no one is left behind. And if we look at the main messages, the missions of all the great religious bodies and groups around the world, there is a dedication to alleviating poverty, to protecting our planet home, and making sure that everyone has enough. So as people of faith gathered here in Brasilia, we're gathered here because we know our faith's demand of us to create a world where no one is left behind. And I think the reality is throughout history, we can look at the power of the faith community and interfaith movements. When we really look at everything from the right to vote to, in the United States, the civil rights movement, to the massive movement around the world to end global poverty or move forward debt relief, it's always been major faith leaders who have been the backbone of every major social movement of creating and building the common good. Leaving no one behind, I think the reason it's the message, the theme of this conference is it really brings together that imperative, that demand that we all share as people of faith, that we're called to love one another. We're called to live in community. We're called to take care of the least among us. We're called to leave no one behind. One of the greatest challenges that we're facing and one of the most important dialogues that's taking place in the G20 right now are the actual causes of poverty. So when we talk about the reality that the majority of the world's countries are struggling, are developing countries, there are reasons for that. And the dialogue that's taking place in the G20 is about the reasons there are poverty. So one of the reasons that there's poverty is that countries have too much debt. And they take on debt to try and pay their bills, and they take on more debt to pay their previous debt. We saw during the pandemic the reality that the majority of the world's countries lost decades of development. So the G20 is looking at these underlying issues of poverty, like debt, and how we address problems like debt. There's also other issues that the G20 is looking at in terms of connected to poverty and inequality. Another major issue is tax issues. None of us really like to pay taxes, but unfortunately there are many of us, including some of the wealthiest corporations in the world, who are not paying any taxes. So the G20 is also looking to change that because they know not only do we need taxes for infrastructure, for funds to protect the environment, without that money, governments don't have the resources they need to deal with poverty. And then I think the last area that the G20 is really looking at right now along this is around how do we get economic aid to the people who need it most, and how do we ensure it goes to those people and is not used for corrupt purposes. So there are several ways that they're looking to do that. The G20, as one of the most powerful decision-making bodies on earth, has to find the money and the resources. And so one of the ways they're looking at is getting resources for what are called multilateral development banks. So all around the world, there are these banks, the Asian Development Bank, the Africa Development Bank, and their role is to provide resources to alleviate poverty, to make sure people have enough food, and be able to protect the environment. So right now, the G20 is debating how to get more money into these institutions that are the closest to poverty and can do the most to promote real economic growth and development. And the other area sounds very complicated, but this idea called special drawing rights. So when we talk about the power of the faith community, one of the wonderful, powerful things we moved at the G20 during the pandemic is we won more than $650 billion in aid 300 billion of which has now gone to developing countries. And so when we talk about the power of faith and the G20, we saw how the faith community was able to move the presidents of the 20 wealthiest industrialized countries of the world to do the right thing and be able to create this new currency to deal with poverty. So all of these issues are on the wheelhouse of the G20. One other issue that I would mention, because it's also connected to people who struggle with poverty, is the G20 is also looking at this issue of human trafficking. And we have to understand that human trafficking, people who are exploited for labor or sexual exploitation, these terrible things that happen that the faith community is universally trying to stop and has rallied behind. The G20 has a very special focus on this in terms of they make the rules on financial transparency, corruption, and secrecy. And when we talk about things like human trafficking and how poor people are moved to be sexually exploited or to be taken advantage of for their work, when we talk about those particular things, financial secrecy, things like anonymous shell companies enable this kind of taking hostage of people and moving them. So the G20 is also looking at these financial issues related to stopping the scourge of human trafficking. I know we can, because as people of faith, we are a people of hope. And the good news story is that in the end, we all have the ability to have life, that God loves us so much that God created a rich and abundant world, and we're closest to one another, and we're closest to the Creator when we're sharing those resources amongst us. I think the reality of what we've seen over the last 25 years of the history of my organization is how the faith community has consistently moved the United Nations, the G20, the G7 on economic imperatives. I think at times we're definitely frustrated because it seems sometimes the G20 and other world leaders are not moving quickly enough to deal with these great challenges of our time. But that's also where our moral responsibility comes in, and the fact that people of faith are people of hope, that it's up to us to move those leaders and make sure that decisions are continuing to move in the right direction. One of the great things that gives a lot of us gathered here hope right now is that 2025 is the next official Jubilee year of Christian churches. And 25 years ago, Jubilee 2000 was a powerful moment where Christians, Muslims, and Jews came together, won $130 billion in debt relief, created policies to stop corruption around the globe, and promote transparency. And the amazing thing about that $130 billion we won back in 2000 is all of that money had to be used for social infrastructure, for healthcare, education, ending child poverty. Because of that money we've won, 54 million kids are going to school in Africa who never would have seen the inside of a classroom. So we have hope because of that promise. And we were with Pope Francis in June, as well as the finance minister from Brazil. And at that meeting, Pope Francis said, as we approach the Jubilee year of 2025, the G20 must do three things. Number one, move forward debt relief and create new processes that can end poverty. Number two, we need more economic aid from the G20 in decisions to protect our environment and to be able to address the needs of human beings. And number three, we need to raise the actual resources to protect the rainforest, to protect our planet home. So this Jubilee year, as we gather here in Brazil and prepare for that Jubilee year, is a powerful time as people of faith because we know we've won so much, and we know over the next 2 years we're going to win even more. The groups and communities that are gathered here, looking at these policy issues, it's absolutely critical that this gathering is taking place. We know that if people of faith did not meet on these issues that matter, if that didn't happen, the decisions that we've won would never have been won. If we don't engage the things that need to happen right now to end poverty, address inequality, and protect our planet won't happen. So this gathering here, this interfaith gathering of some of the world's most influential religious leaders, is absolutely critical in terms of building a world, creating a world where we all have enough.